We're thrilled to have the opportunity to present the Convention of States to you. Mike and I recently became co-state directors for Minnesota for the Convention of States project. I'm going to do the first part of this presentation, and Mike is going to take over from there. And to get it started, how many of you think that the federal government has grown too big and perhaps become oppressive? I see an awful lot of hands up. Well, the framers of the Constitution feared that this day would come because they knew from history and from their own experience that, I'm getting the signal here to hold it up here, that concentrated power leads to tyranny. So as we all know, they built things into our Constitution to try and prevent that, to try and keep the government in check. Things like separation of powers, various checks and balances, the enumerated powers, the concept of federalism. But they started to become concerned that that might not be enough, and maybe an emergency procedure might be needed. So 2 days before the Constitutional Convention was ready to adjourn, their current draft of the Constitution gave the Congress the only authority to amend the Constitution. And Colonel George Mason rose up and he said, "No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive. No amendments of the proper kind would ever be obtained by the people if the government should become oppressive." And the delegates agreed with him, and they unanimously voted to add language into Article V of the Constitution. That's the amending article. And what they added was they gave the state legislatures the ability to propose amendments to the Constitution. And by giving the state legislatures the ability, the power, and the authority to propose amendments to the Constitution, they were putting the state legislatures in charge of ensuring that the federal government did not get out of control. If it did, they had the power to rein it back in. So it's their duty. Now, the objectives of the Convention of States project is to work with and encourage state legislatures across the country to use this power and apply for a Convention of States for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution that would place fiscal restraints on the government, limit its power and jurisdiction, and limit terms of office. And I'm going to show you a short video here that gives a good overview, and then we'll dig into this a little bit deeper. Maybe. Okay, let's try it again. Worked every other time. There we go.
The United States Constitution was written to form a more perfect union that would enable checks and balances to prevent a bloody revolution from being a necessary measure to abolish tyranny. Excellent though it was, Colonel George Mason feared the
We've had trouble with the audio all night here.
Tyrannical aristocracy. The rights of the people needed to be secured against potential corruption at the national.
I'm going to restart it.
The United States Constitution was written to form a more perfect union that would enable checks and balances to prevent a bloody revolution from being a necessary measure to abolish tyranny. Excellent though it was, Colonel George Mason feared the national government might one day end in a tyrannical aristocracy. The rights of the people needed to be secured against potential corruption at the national level. One of the solutions the framers decided upon can be found in Article V, which gives state legislators the authority to call a convention that bypasses federal legislators to amend the Constitution. That gives we the people the opportunity to make some long overdue structural adjustments, maybe term limits would be a good place to start. Here's how the process works. Citizens request their state legislators to pass a bill called an application with operative language identical in each state. These legislators of the states then pass the application. Generally, only a simple majority is needed. Congress shall, by law, call a convention of the states as soon as it receives applications from 2/3 of the state legislatures. That's 34 states. Delegates chosen by the state legislatures attend the convention. Each state only gets one vote at the convention, but they can send as many delegates to represent the state as they so choose. Amendments are proposed, debated, and voted upon at the convention. Finally, ratification takes place in the states. Each amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to become part of the U.S. Constitution. But what about a runaway convention?
Come.
Let's get a reality check. Like constitutional law scholar Robert G. Nadelson says, there are far more political and legal constraints on a runaway convention than on a runaway Congress. The convention delegates, also called commissioners, are bound to the will of their state legislatures. If they don't vote as their states demand, they get recalled and might even get sent to prison. Furthermore, a full 3/4 of the state legislatures, we're talking 38 state legislatures, must ratify each and every amendment in order for it to become part of the U.S. Constitution. Even Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, who favored national government, emphasized that Article V gives states authority over the national government. Hamilton writes that national rulers have no option upon the subject. The words of Article V are peremptory. The Congress shall call a convention. And Lincoln says the convention mode seems preferable in that it allows amendments to originate with the people themselves. Article V Convention of the States is a safe route to stopping federal overreach. Civilizations rise and fall. Let's be a civilization that saw the cycle of collapse coming and broke it.
Topics we're going to cover tonight is we're going to look at some areas of government abuse. We're going to look at Article V, dig into that a little bit, explain the amending process. She did a good job of giving an overview there. We're going to look a little bit at the concerns she mentioned about runaway convention and some of the opponents will put up in front of it. And Mike is going to get up and he's going to explain the Convention of States project itself, who's involved, how it operates, and if you like what you see, we hope you'll join us. Major areas of abuse by the federal government, clearly spending and debt has to be at the top. We'll take a look at some regulatory crisis. State sovereignty is an issue here, and we'll take a look at how the branches of the government are operating outside the confines of the Constitution. We won't look at all of it because there's too much, but we'll look at some of it. Spending and debt. Earlier this month, the national debt just went over $18 trillion. That's such a big number, it's hard to even fathom. But if you divide that out amongst the taxpayers, it's $150,000 per taxpayer of debt that the federal government is placed on our shoulders. That's on top of debt we've incurred ourselves for mortgages or car payments or Dwayne.
Point of clarification, is that people that actually pay taxes?
Pay taxes. Yep, pay taxes. These numbers come out of the national debt clock. I got them a few weeks ago. They might have changed a smidgen, but...
So I was going to ask the same question, a little clarification. That is a number of people eligible to pay taxes. That's our
taxpayers.
People that actually pay
right.
rather than receive.
Taxpayers,
okay,
yep.
Good.
Taxpayers. So, a large number there. But that's not the worst of it. We've got over $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And those are promises the government has made to give benefits to people. And unfunded means they don't have the money to pay for it. The benefits are Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And Congress is doing absolutely nothing about this. You've seen it. You've watched this. It's been going on for a long time. And you just can't ignore the laws of economics. You look in history, countries that have done this, that have compiled debt that they can't pay for, collapse. And that happens here. Our children, our grandchildren, their grandchildren will be stuck with this debt. Fiscal restraints must be placed on the federal government because they have clearly demonstrated that they're incapable of restraining themselves. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wished this had happened. Whoops, what did I do here? It didn't go. Thomas Jefferson, regarding the Bill of Rights. He said, I wish there was one more amendment taking away the government's ability to borrow. Now, wouldn't that have been something if that had happened back then? Take a quick look at the regulatory crisis, I call it. Say estimated $1.8 trillion is the annual cost to our economy of the federal regulations. That's about a 10% drag on the economy. Our GDP is running about $17.5 trillion now, 17.4, 17.5, somewhere in there. So that's a 10% drag on the economy. It takes 10 billion hours just to fill out the associated paperwork, to say nothing of the actual cost of implementing those regulations. And Congress has a great deal of, is at fault here to a great extent, because they have delegated much of their legislative authority over to the federal agencies who write these regulations. Now, John Stossel did a piece a while back. Well, let me back up a bit here. They take these regulations and they package them up into volumes, and they're called the Code of Federal Regulations. Back to John Stossel, he did a piece a while back where he took his tape measure and he went into the Library of Congress. He looked up where these codes of regulations were, and he measured how much shelf space they took. They took a little over 25 feet when he did this. Now I put some green tape on the wall over here, some green tape on the wall over there. That's 25 feet of federal regulations. Now the picture on the left here is just a shot of some of those shelves that I was talking about. The picture on the right is the Code of Federal Regulations in 1925, 90 years ago. It was one 3-inch volume about the size of a typical dictionary. So, not only, and clearly we need some regulations. I'm not trying to say that we don't need some. But that volume of regulations is clearly smothering the economy in the previous chart. But what I'd like to make a point to you here is that volume of regulation also represents our lost liberty. Because those regulations are telling us what we can and can't do and what we must do. So think of it that way as well. I'm going to move on here to state sovereignty. Here I'm going to go back to the framers of the Constitution again. When they designed how the federal government was to work, the senators were appointed by their state legislatures. And this gave the states a major voice in the operation of the federal government. And it also helped restrain the federal government from growing outside its bounds. Because if they want to expand their power, they would be encroaching on the states, and these senators representing the states would push back on that and not allow that to happen. Along came the 17th Amendment back in 1913, and it made the senators popularly elected. And what that did is that took the state government's voice out of the operation of the federal government. By a senator being popularly elected, it's not much different than the House of Representatives. In fact, I'd say it's worse, because they cover a greater distance, the whole state. You can't just go see your U.S. senator. One thing, they probably aren't there. As we found out in the last election, some of them don't even bother to live in the state they represent. But the other thing is that they only get elected every 6 years. So they're spending 6 years in Washington, D.C., not back in their states, plus they're not beholden to the state legislature. I'm just going to mention the, whoops, I pushed the wrong button here. The 10th Amendment here, largely ignored, but I really wanted to read the words here. I think most of you know it. The powers not delegated to the United States are reserved for the states and the people, and that's what has been encroached upon. I want to mention another thing with Congress in the states. Congress uses this scheme of putting money on the table called mandates. And states are, I'm sorry, not mandates, grants. The states are always hungry for money, so they accept those grants. But the grants have strings attached to them called mandates. And this has been going, and they tell the states what they have to do because they took the money. But it's been going on so long, the federal government many times just sends the mandates down and tells the states what to do. So what's happened here over time is the states are really nothing more than regional agencies of the federal government, not those independent governments that was envisioned by the framers. So in summary down here, the states have lost their ability to hold the federal government in check, and I believe federalism has been, for all purposes, lost. Federal government breaching the Constitution. We'll just step down through here. I just listed the three major branches. I think there's a fourth branch, the bureaucracy, that has probably as much power as any of these do. The executive branch. We've all seen the executive branch likes to legislate. They have absolutely no constitutional authority to do that, but they do. They selectively enforce the laws, despite having taken an oath to faithfully uphold the laws. They've been using the federal agencies to spy unconstitutionally on citizens. Think the NSA, reading our emails and tracking our cell phone calls. Use other agencies to attack citizens they disagree with. The IRS, and obviously the Tea Party has been very much involved with that. We'll move down to the legislative branch. Legislate far beyond their authority. Congress has set itself up as a superior legislature over all of the states, and this was never intended. The Constitution gave the federal government certain enumerated powers, and all other powers were reserved for the states and for the people. We just saw that over here in the previous slide. And we mentioned on the previous slide that Congress has delegated extensive power to the regulatory departments, and they've been very lax on defending their constitutional powers. And when they don't defend them, their powers, the other branches become more powerful. In this case, particularly the executive branch. If they're not going to defend their powers here, and one of the chief powers they have to do that with is the power of the purse, but they have pledged not to do that. We move down to the judicial branch here. They also like to legislate. They call it legislating from the bench. They make political rulings. They don't do a good job of upholding original intent, and there is no recourse to their rulings. They've gotten themselves in a position where they have the final say. And so we have 9 fallible human beings that are in a position of having the final say over 330 million of us. And found out recently in 30 different Supreme Court rulings, they have said there is no check on our power other than our own internal sense of self-restraint. Wow. So, what does this mean? This isn't a partisan issue. These things are being done without our consent. Well, a recent poll earlier this year found that 77% of Americans said the greatest threat to our liberty is the federal government. 77% of the people can hardly agree on anything, but they agreed on that. I'm going to, just a quick quote from Jefferson here that I think goes with this. When he said, "When the government fears the people, there's liberty. When the people fear the government, there's tyranny." I think we've all heard that one before. But down at the bottom here, Washington, D.C. is never going to relinquish any meaningful power, no matter who is elected. Can't tell you how many times I've heard we've got to elect good people and send them to Washington. And we do. And they go there with their principles intact. But once they get there, they get co-opted by the corrupt culture in Washington, D.C. And there's not very many of them that can withstand that. And then they become part of that culture. And nothing changes. This has been going on for decades. Send good people there and nothing changes. We need to do something different. I'm reminded here on this point of Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We've got to do something different. That is not working. So, I think we're approaching a crossroads here that we can do nothing. It's going to lead to continued loss of liberty, financial ruin for our children, or we can use the tools that the framers gave us and rein in the federal government. But I would say the time is running short and we need to act while we still can. So, what is this tool that the framers solution in Article, whoops, I keep forgetting to move that. This solution that the framers gave us in Article V. Article V is the amending article. There's two ways to propose amendments to the Constitution at a very high level. There's only one amending authority. We're going to dig into this a little bit. So this is the actual text of Article V. The part in yellow is what the framers added in the final days of the Constitutional Convention that I mentioned at the start here. I'm going to read it. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by Congress. Okay, I'm going to dig into this just a little bit further. So, just a diagram here. The first process is when 2/3 of both houses of Congress propose an amendment. They send it to the states. And they can send it to the states and specify that it to be ratified, 3/4 of the state legislatures have to ratify it. Or they could choose to send it to the states, and ratification is by conventions in 3/4 of the states. So on the right-hand side, that ratification process is always the same. The second process for proposing amendments is amendments proposed by convention of states, called at the request of 2/3 of the state legislatures. So we just read a minute ago. And then the ratification process is the same. Congress can choose to send any proposed amendments to the state legislatures, where it requires 3/4 of them to ratify it, or send it to the states in conventions in 3/4 of the states. I'm going to do one more chart on this. This is the process for states to propose amendments. So 2/3 of the 50 states is 34 states. So number one here, when 34 states submit an application for calling an amending convention for the same issue, so that they can't have on their application one state is a balanced budget amendment and the other one, another state is an equal rights amendment. They have to be for the same issue. When Congress receives 34 or more applications for the same issue, Congress is required to call the amending convention. It says in the Constitution they shall. It's not, they have a choice. Now the states send delegates to this convention, what it's called. They're called commissioners, and they propose possible amendments, they debate them, and they vote on them. And it just takes a simple majority for a proposed amendment to be approved by the convention. That doesn't mean it's ratified, it's just approved out of the convention. Congress then sends approved amendments to the states for ratification. And as we saw before, it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify it. With 50 states, that's 38 states are required to ratify a proposed amendment. That's probably more depth than you wanted to ever get into on the amending process. But that's key to this whole project. Now, I mentioned before that opponents to using the Convention of States for proposing amendments to the Constitution often say, well, the Convention could be a runaway, could lose control of it, or the wrong types of amendments could come out of it, or the Constitution could be discarded and a new one rewritten. In those that are talked about the Constitution being entirely rewritten, they often will say that the 1787 Constitutional Convention was a runaway. I've got handouts here of a pretty detailed historical analysis that proves that that's not the case. But in case somebody is of that thinking, please see me, and I've got a handout for you to take a look at. But opponents call an amending convention a con-con. Kind of, I think, a derogatory term. It's short for Constitutional Convention. And when they say it, and you saw that, probably didn't catch it, when you saw it in that video earlier, this guy pops up and says con-con. They're just implying that an amending convention is a constitutional convention. There's been numerous conventions of the state throughout our country's history, none of which have run away. But to the skeptics here, there are safeguards to a runaway. And I'm going to step through this, because if you become involved in this, people will say, well, it'll run away. Let's look at number one here. I'm going to just step down through them. The state's applications for the convention, they define the scope of the convention. As we said before, let's go to number two. All of the applications must be for a similar scope or they will be rejected. So that defines the scope of the convention. The convention call that comes from Congress specifies the scope of the convention based on all of these applications they got in from the 34 or more states. Number four, the states can recall delegates who don't follow the instructions they were given. So you've got somebody off in the woods here proposing things that aren't in the scope, they can call them back. 5, Congress will not forward any amendments to the states for ratification that are outside the scope of the convention. So you can see there's bounds put around this. It makes it very difficult for it to run away or even something outside the scope to make it through. Number 6, obviously any missteps here are open to legal challenges. But the biggie is right here at the bottom in yellow. As we learned before, it takes 38 states to ratify a proposed amendment. Let me say that a different way. It takes 76 legislative bodies, 2 in each of the states, 76 legislative bodies, to look at this amendment proposal and say, yes, we agree, this should become part of the Constitution. A rogue amendment, if it made it through all of that, is not going to make it through there. Let me flip it around the other way and say it only takes 13 states doing absolutely nothing with a proposed amendment for it just to sit there and languish and never become part of the Constitution. So there are a lot of safeguards there. With all of these checks, the odds of a runaway convention approach 0. And as Professor Nadelson said in that opening video, there are far more controls on a runaway convention than on a runaway federal government. Yes?
But where are all these rules codified? It's not in our Constitution, right?
The rules are, here, that's an excellent question. The generalities are in the Constitution. I read you what's in there. Where they come from is historical precedent on how these, there's been like 200 conventions of the states throughout our history and how those have been put together. Now, Dwayne Quam is going to talk here in a few minutes too about, he's been involved with a group of legislators from across the country that are anticipating that this Convention of the States will be called in the next few years, and they're starting to put together procedures and that in rules that they will propose to the convention when it starts. But it really goes back to historical precedent, how these things have been dealt with over the last 300 years, because these kinds of conventions were going on between the states before it even became the United States. They had issues to resolve. They'd have a convention of states. That's said in today's vernacular, they would have a meeting of states to resolve the issues, and so that's the answer to that question. So here's where we are when we look at this risk of a runaway. If we're not willing to take the negligible risk of a runaway convention to restore our country, then perhaps we're not worthy of the liberties that our founders fought and died for and tried to provide for us. I've got one more chart, kind of building off of that last thought, and then we're going to turn it over to Mike. It's a quote from John Adams, George Washington's vice president, our second president. He also anticipated that our country might find itself in its current position, where the federal government had grown far outside of its bounds. And he spoke directly to us in this quote. It's got exclamation marks in it, so I'll try and say it as he might have. Posterity. That's us. That's us. We're his posterity. Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you'll make good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. An interesting quote. But what I'd say in response to John Adams, we need to each make a decision here. Are we going to stand with Washington, D.C. in its continual slide into tyranny? Or are we going to stand up and participate in putting our country back on track like the founders expected us to do? I think hopefully we're in the latter. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Black now, who's going to take you through the actual Convention of States organization, the plan, how it's going to work. And Mike?
My name is Mike Black, and I've been working with Jim over the last couple of months on this process. Essentially, it's nationwide. There's currently 45 states that have this process going in them. And Jim and I were at a meeting earlier this spring. I got up and kind of complained about nothing was going on, and we needed to be able to do something else, and this is what I found. 2 months ago, there was no organization in the state of Minnesota, and Jim and I kept bugging the national people looking for some help. And finally they said, you guys be quiet or we'll make you state directors, and we weren't quiet, so here we are as state directors. The Convention of States approach is primarily different in the sense that it's a national process. If you look at the website for the parent sponsoring organization, the Citizens for Self-Governance, you can see that there are many common ideas and shared strategies that have previously been used on a national level. In other words, this isn't their first rodeo. Instead of having just a few individuals or organizations trying to lobby for specific legislation or bringing lawsuits against the federal government, the idea is to bring citizens into the process and have them contact their state legislators to let them know that they're concerned and that they, the citizens, support this idea. Our state legislators respond much better to local calls and comments than they do to national organizations working on some type of an agenda. And again, the idea is to make it simple and a central theme. So the plan. We've all probably called our national legislators, mostly to no avail. So we need to do something different. In the Convention of States plan is to call a convention for a particular subject rather than a particular amendment. Because the problems that we're experiencing now are bigger than what one single amendment could solve. And it's also to build a grassroots organization of sufficient size to accomplish this objective. We haven't had that done previously. Scope of application. This is kind of what Jim was talking about before in terms of where we need to go. In the application, it does say impose fiscal restraints. It does say limit the power and jurisdiction. And it does say limit the terms of office. Those are common themes amongst all of the amendments to be considered. All of the states that have tried in the past have listed a specific cause rather than a call for the process. That's the difference. What we're trying to accomplish is a rather broad-based approach to have enough states call for a convention under general terms, with the idea being that the discussion can take place on specific amendments to be considered at the convention. That should avoid the trap of not having 34 states use the same consistent wording. So we avoid some states looking for a balanced budget amendment, we avoid some states looking for term limits. We work ourselves out of that trap. If we all use the same language on the application, then we won't be falling into that trap of not having 34 identical applications. This is, I know it's small print, that's not the point, that's the application. So it's, as you can see from the slide, there's not a lot of verbiage to it, okay? The only thing that they're asking people to make different when they file it in their state legislatures is the red arrows, and that's where your state is. The highlighted language is what I talked about before, and that's the underlying things. Those are primary concerns for the majority of the states, but it's not asking for a specific amendment. And so again, what we're trying to do is to keep it simple. The process is that this legislative call or this legislative document would be filed in all the states so that everybody's working off of the same thing. Some possible amendment topics. Requiring a balanced budget. And let's think about that for a second. We can do that by increasing taxes or borrowing more money. Obviously, that's what we want to try to stay away from. But we need to get into some kind of a process to limit spending, borrowing, and taxation. Recent figures show that we are borrowing about 40 cents of every dollar that we spend on the national level. We need to change that. Term limits would allow us to, over time, remove those individuals that are not defending their state. Right now, we've got a lot of people in power that are in Washington and for one particular reason, and that's because they like being there. No one's there representing you and I, no one's there representing their states, and that's kind of the issue that we run into. When we look back at, again, what Jim was saying about the 17th Amendment, U.S. senators were originally appointed by the states. They were there to protect the state from the federal government, and that doesn't happen any longer. I don't know if you've ever heard of Mark Levin. He has written a book called The Liberty Amendments. He's also had some pretty good speeches, and one of the things that he spoke about at one of the recent conventions with the legislators at the American Legislative Exchange Council, there was a speech where he was really challenging the state-level legislators to bring the power back to the states. And he said, and I quote, "By giving the state legislatures the ultimate say on major federal laws, on major federal regulations, on major Supreme Court decisions, should 3/5 of state legislatures act to override them within a 2-year period, it doesn't much matter what Washington does or doesn't do. It matters only what you do." And that's really where this legislation is trying to get to as well, and that is to give the states the right to tell the EPA, no, we're going to keep burning coal. It's to tell some of the federal judges that have been in place in some of these states to say, no, we disagree with your decision. We're not going to do that. And 3/5 of the states, if we carry that, anything they impose doesn't matter any longer. It puts the power back with the states. The leadership of the Convention of States process, project, excuse me, a couple of smart guys. Mark Meckler was one of the original co-founders of the National Tea Party. Michael Ferris is a United States constitutional lawyer. He's a founder of the Home School Legal Defense Association and has argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of experience there with not only with trying things in front of the Supreme Court, but also with trying to get some national organization. And in addition, there are a number of very skilled and intelligent people that are part of the behind-the-scenes work that is taking place. And in reference to your question, sir, about where does this stuff come from and how does it get, these are the people that have looked back at kind of historically what's happened and trying to use references from those earlier processes, how the things are going to get applied. One thing you could do, you could read it's called the Jefferson Statement on the Convention of States website, or you can Google it. It's the first link that comes up if you Google the Jefferson Statement. Basically, it's a very public declaration of intent by the people listed here to rein in the federal government. There's no underground conspiracy going on. These folks have said, this is the process we're going to use, and we're right out in the open with it. There isn't anything crazy going on here. These individuals have an incredible amount of experience dealing with problems on such a national scope, and that's what the issue is here. It's not something that you and I can individually do something about. But if we band together and use this process, we can get it moving. And our legislators, Mr. Quam, will probably leave here knowing that if we've got his back and he's working on something at the state level, they're going to be much more willing, I think, to listen to us and to try to help. So the plan is to build a viable political operation in at least 3,000 of the 4,000 state house districts in 40 states. 3,000 district captains who will organize 100 people. There are 3 statewide leadership positions: the state director, Jim and I are state directors for Minnesota, the legislative liaison, and the coalitions director. The legislative liaison works with the legislators, trying to get them information, helping them talk to other members, trying to help them get organized. So that's their job. We have one in place. His name is Thomas Johansson. We have a coalitions director currently. I'm not going to give you her name because she may not be there any longer. However, the coalitions director's job is to work with businesses and organizations that are looking for information and to try to help them. Jim and I are the co-state directors for Minnesota, and our job is to organize the district captains. And the district captain's job, as we spoke, was to try to get 100 people in each Senate district in Minnesota. There's 67 districts in the state of Minnesota. So our job is to try to get 67 district captains in place and then help them in whatever process they need, whether it's information, whether it's making phone calls, whether it's going to meetings or doing things like this. Our job is to try to help those 67 district captains get 100 people in place. Because if we can do that, if we concentrate on each Senate district in Minnesota and try to generate enough support from each one, we should be able to have every legislator in the state of Minnesota receive a call from a number of constituents asking them to support this process when we get the legislation in place. That's our plan. That's what we're trying to do. We all know how they do respond to us, but we have to have enough people. We can't just every once in a while talk to one of our neighbors. We have to be willing to put in some time. And what does that mean then for volunteers? It means you need to encourage your legislators. It means when the time is needed to send emails, to write them a letter, to make phone calls, and sometimes maybe even attend committee meetings. And it does also mean to talk to other people about the process. The current status, 3 states have completed their applications in 2014. There's 31 states in play this year that they think they'll have legislation in progress, and they're working on getting it passed. That would be this year as of 2015. But there currently is grassroots operations in 45 states. And so the thinking is that as long as we keep hammering away at this and we keep pushing and keep moving on it, that Minnesota, if we're lucky enough, might be part of the group that helps cross that 34-state threshold in 2016. Unlikely that we'll get legislation introduced this year, but you never know. Yes, sir?
Have you done any analysis on the likelihood of success in a state like Minnesota And if so, rather than doing a lot of effort here, would it be more useful to put resources at helping a different state?
It's a good question, and they are doing that to some extent. What is happening is for most of the states where they're thinking they're going to carry that, they're working a lot harder than this in those states. And I think currently there are 30 states that the Republicans hold both houses. There are 11 states where they're split, the House or Senate is Republican, and there are 8 states which are democratically held, and so for both houses. So what they're thinking is that it's time to move, that there is quite a bit, I think, of support for the process. Now, we've said before, and I do believe this in my heart, I don't always, but it has to be bipartisan. I mean, this has to be, we have to reach across the aisle, but I think when we talk to people across the aisle and talk to them about bringing the power back to the state of Minnesota so that we can make those decisions that are important to us rather than someone in Washington, I think that may have some appeal to them. But if we look at where the stats are right now, 30 states that are controlled by the Republicans. And this is obviously getting driven from the Republican side of the ledger. I mean, that's happening. And so I think that's why they're kind of doubling down on this right now, that there is more effort in those states that have a better chance of success. Now, obviously, Minnesota's split, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't try to get something along. They're more than willing to come and meet with our legislators if we get to a position where we've got enough people for them to listen to. The national guys aren't going to come up here if we can only put 2 or 3 people in a meeting. But if we can put half the House in a meeting somewhere, they're going to pay attention to us. Yes, sir.
The governor has nothing to do with it then?
The governor has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Good.
So we can be thankful of that. Yes, sir.
Now, this respect for the precedent, is that the same respect for precedent that keeps appointees from being approved with less than 60 votes inside? Is that same respect for precedent?
I don't think I understand your question.
There is no respect for precedent
You mean from our current legislators or from,
from the current legislature.
or the executive branch?
Or the legislative branch that we have currently.
So what you're telling me is that why would they pay attention to us now? Is that kind of what you're saying? All right, good question, and it's a valid point. They're not really paying attention to us much right now. But I think if you go back to the point I made earlier about the 3/5 of the states, that essentially they can, I think, continue to tell us to do things and to continue to try to take power away from the states. But if we have enough states that are more worried about states' rights than national rights, we can override them. The states have the ability to put the federal government back in place. And what's happened is we haven't really done that. You're absolutely correct that their interpretation, the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, is what we're reacting to now. And there are many people that are very upset with that process, and there are a lot of people that disagree with it. And they're ignoring us. You're absolutely correct. But the thing is, we have to bring the power back to the states so that the states can ignore the federal government to the extent, that that's possible. And I think we can do that. Yes, sir.
I think it's important historically to realize that sometimes these movements, when they've gotten close to getting the number of states, that the legislature starts panicking and then they say, let's us write the amendment, and then they'll, 2/3 of the Congress may decide, hey, we want to control the language of this thing, and they might pass out an amendment.
I think you're absolutely correct. I do think also, though, that that's what has been the problem in the past. If you look at the people that are behind this thing and where it kind of got generated from, it's in response to that process. And I think you're absolutely correct. But I think that their point is also right. It's very valid. You have to go in there with the same language, because if they don't, everybody, here's 4 for this pile, here's 6 for this pile, nobody ever gets to 34. You're absolutely correct. And that's what I think what we're trying to drive it from the citizens' standpoint upward into the legislators, as opposed to the other way around. I think if we can show these people that there's enough support out there, that when we ask them to spend their political capital, I mean, and that's what's happening if they go off and do it by themselves, you know, we can't ask them to do that. They have to have some support. And so that's why we're trying to change this around a little bit. We're trying, Jim and I, we're going to get 67 people, and we're going to help them get 100 people. So that if we have a chance to have the legislation considered, people like Dwayne are going to get a call, and they're going to say, please, pay attention to this.
Do you have a list of Minnesota representatives and senators that are already supporting this?
I don't have a list of those people who are supporting this, because what we're, like I said, 2 months ago, nothing was going on. And even a month ago, Jim and I, even though we were the co-state, we had no clue what was going on. So it's taken us a while. I can tell you this, there are people out there that are interested, and there are people out there that will help us. But again, if we're going to ask them to, you know, put their skin on the game, then we gotta have some support for them. We have to be willing to help them with. We did talk about this a little bit, I guess, that Dwayne has been, and Mr. Qualm has been involved in these discussions before, and they've had a number of these meetings, and it's been bipartisan. So it hasn't just been one side of the ledger running around trying to create this process. And they're trying to set the rules up so that when Congress has to call the convention, that they're ready to go. So a clip from the Colorado State Senator at one of the meetings last year, and I think I'll just kind of give you a better feel for that. There are other states that are looking at this process too.
Kevin Lundberg, State Senator, Colorado, and National Co-Chair for the Article V Caucus. Today we're having that first organizational meeting for the Article V Caucus. I'm thrilled to see so many people from so many different states that are starting to focus on this essential need for the states to stand up against Washington and exercise their constitutional responsibility to demand Washington live within its means. Over the last several weeks, as we've begun to organize the Article V Caucus, we've seen from across the country legislators banding together to support one another, to encourage one another, to simply identify who is committed to putting this idea into action. I believe we're just seeing the very beginning of the process, where legislators, a majority of legislators, I believe, understand the problem, that Washington has taken over responsibilities that the states really need to be in charge of. And what I'm seeing is a tremendous number of legislators who just are naturally saying, yes, this is a great idea. We need to band together. We need to encourage one another. We need to figure out how to make this these thoughts reality. And the really extraordinary thing to me is how easy it is to pull people into this, because they know their experience as legislators has taught them that something's broken in Washington, and it's the states that have to fix the problem.
Representative Qualm.
Thank you, and I should clarify, it was said that if you get behind me, then I won't. I've never been characterized by the words timid or fearful. Frankly, it's effectiveness of what we get done. Mike Benson, myself, and others stood up and rallied against some of the taxes. Well, some of us talked about most of the taxes, but there were some really egregious taxes that they threw together in the budget. We complained, we did everything we could. They had the power, they passed it through. But when you, the people, and other people across the state, stood up, raised your voices, and were heard, the governor said, oh, I didn't know it was there. We'll have to take care of that. And it got done. So when we have people that are cautious, well, it couldn't happen in Minnesota. Frankly, you are the people that would make it happen. Now, Nels Pearson will be starting in January, and I and others we're the people that will do the mechanism, the work, and execute. But with you and others working across the state, we will be able to get the votes, the support, and the legislation through to make things like this and other things happen. Now, everybody remember medical marijuana. That was hotly contested. I had issues with gaps and some shortcomings. I did not have issues with a state standing up and saying, we, the legislators, the representatives of the citizens of this great state, feel that it's our responsibility to take care and watch out for the welfare and the best for our citizens. And that we did not abdicate that to the federal government. Therefore, we're going to do this. That effort was part of the constitutional sovereignty of the state of Minnesota. And once we use in our conversations with people things that they will accept, well, yeah, we've got states all over the nation that are doing things like that. So it's okay, it's right. In fact, it's becoming more common to realize that Washington does not only, not solve our problems, but make more for us. That we in the states need to take care of it because we know better what our citizens, what our situations are. Now, I did attend the December 7th, 2013 in Mount Vernon at the Washington Library. They shut that down, they opened up a little area, and only legislators were allowed to go in. And what we did is we said, there are problems. This is a possible way that we can address them, but first, before we debate any content, we need to set the guidelines, the rules, procedures, and the process we'll follow to have an organized convention if we get the states to support it. And that's the involvement that it's sort of been building. Now, I have no problem with bringing forward an application. I have waited for, in legal terms, the issue to ripen. In other words, get to a point where there was consensus so that we had uniformity across the states of what we were going to go forward with, because I didn't want to be early and have something that wasn't uniform and then try to fight that battle twice. But be assured that with the activities of this group and others, we are at a point where we can have 34 legal applications or more before Congress. But one thing you have to remember, why now? It's because we have a president where 2/3 of the people feel he's overstepping his bounds. We have a consensus, even among Democrats, that Washington is out of control. And in state legislatures, they have the hubris to feel that they know better. Well, that works in our favor because they can agree with us that Washington doesn't know what's best, we do. And that should all come together and give us, this window of opportunity.
Those of you who've served in the military, you've given so much already. Thank you very much for your time. Those of you who have been involved politically, you have huge amounts of time and effort invested in the process, and thank you. But we need to do more. All of us need to do more. We need to put away the things where we're thinking about our personal benefits, and we need to think about if you have grandkids or great-grandkids or kids, or even thinking about having kids, you need to think about those people. They should have access to the same kind of liberties that we've had. And so it will be challenging, but to quote Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has.
All for coming. We really appreciate it.